The year is 1943. Across the Atlantic, Europe is tearing itself apart. German cities burn under Allied bombs, villages smolder on the Eastern Front, and millions live in fear of hunger and death. Yet, thousands of German soldiers, men captured on distant battlefields in North Africa and Europe, step off American trains into a reality that feels nothing like captivity. The air smells of pine, dust, and farmland. Instead of snarling guards with rifles at the ready, they find orderly camps with wooden barracks, clean bunks, and well-supplied kitchens. Their journey had filled them with dread, for Nazi propaganda had painted America a land of brutality, an enemy that would starve them, beat them, perhaps even kill them. Instead, they discovered what many would later call the Golden Cage. From 1942 to 1945, more than 400,000 Axis prisoners of war, most of them German, were shipped across the ocean to the United States. They were spread across over 500 camps, hidden in plain sight in small towns, military bases, and rural fields. States like Texas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska became unexpected hosts to the men who had once saluted Hitler. America's treatment of them was not accidental. It was rooted in the 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War. While the Axis powers often ignored its provisions, the United States adhered closely to them. Each prisoner was entitled to humane conditions, food rations equal to those of American soldiers, access to medical care, and even recreational activities. For many Germans, it was a shocking reversal of expectation. They were enemies, yet they were fed more generously than their own families back home in Hamburg or Dresden. Reports from the time described their astonishment. One German officer later confessed, "We ate white bread every day. Back home, my wife and children had only dark bread, sometimes none at all." The disparity gnawed at them. In America, their stomachs were full. In Germany, their families starved under rationing and bombing raids. But this cage of comfort was not merely charity. America had practical needs. With millions of young men overseas, the home front faced severe labor shortages. Farms lacked workers to harvest crops, and factories required hands to keep the war machine moving. The solution was pragmatic: put the prisoners to work. In the farmlands of the Midwest and South, it was not uncommon to see uniformed Germans stooping to pick cotton, haul lumber, or gather wheat under the open sky. They earned a small wage, credited in camp canteens, where they could buy cigarettes, toiletries, and even small luxuries. For many Americans, this was an unsettling sight: German soldiers laughing in the fields, their labor helping feed the very country they had been sent to destroy. Local newspapers documented these strange juxtapositions. In Texas, farmers marveled at the efficiency of their new workers. In Nebraska, children whispered about the Germans who marched through town to buy supplies under guard. And in Arkansas, shopkeepers noted the politeness of the POWs who stood in line for candy or soap, indistinguishable from ordinary customers except for their uniforms. Of course, the camps were not without barbed wire or watchtowers. Escape attempts did occur, though rarely with success. A handful of prisoners tunneled under fences, only to be bewildered by America's vastness. One escapee, discovered days later, told authorities he had simply gotten lost in the endless fields and wanted to go back to camp. The irony was clear: captivity in America could feel safer, even preferable, to freedom in wartime Europe. The contradiction ran deep. These were men who had sworn loyalty to Hitler's Reich, men who had fought under the Black Cross of the Wehrmacht, now treated with a civility their own regime rarely extended to its enemies. They were prisoners, yet they played soccer in open fields, sang songs in evening gatherings, and performed plays for one another. Some camps even allowed them to build small libraries, stocked with German classics, newspapers, and later American literature. But the most jarring experience of all awaited them in the evenings. As dusk settled over the camps, the prisoners gathered in makeshift halls or outdoor spaces where a white sheet hung as a screen. A projector hummed to life, and suddenly, the men found themselves staring into another world, the bright, exaggerated dreamscapes of American cinema. Here, in the land of their captors, they were not starved or beaten, they were given stories. Stories of cowboys and gangsters, of families in small towns, of skyscrapers reaching toward the heavens. The movies were meant as entertainment, but soon they would serve another purpose. For what began as a gesture of humanity, a diversion for restless men, would transform into one of the most powerful weapons of re-education the world had ever seen. The stage was set. The golden cage would not only feed and shelter its prisoners, it would illuminate them with images they could neither ignore nor forget. The camp grew quiet after sunset. The laughter from the day's labor faded. Boots shuffled into barracks, and the glow of cigarettes marked the only light in the dark. For German prisoners, the nights were long, filled with whispers of home, of rumors from the front, of fears that the Reich might already be crumbling. And then, unexpectedly, the silence broke not with gunfire or orders, but with the low hum of a projector. The Americans had brought them movies. At first, it seemed almost absurd. Soldiers who had fought across Europe, men trained for battle, now filed into makeshift theaters built from wood and canvas. In some camps, barns were converted into screening halls. In others, a simple white sheet hung against a wall became the screen. Prisoners sat shoulder to shoulder, the smell of dust and sweat heavy in the air, waiting for the reel to begin. The flickering light transformed the barracks. Suddenly, cowboys rode across vast American plains. Comedies filled the halls with laughter, and travelogues unveiled jungles, cities, and oceans the men had never seen. In rare cases, prisoners were even escorted into town to attend local cinemas under guard. Imagine their shock. German soldiers, once hailed as conquerors, now sitting quietly in American theaters, surrounded by civilians eating popcorn. It was a surreal collision of worlds. For many POWs, these screenings were their first unfiltered glimpse of America beyond Nazi propaganda. They studied every detail, the slang in the dialogue, the fashions of women in the audience, the towering skyscrapers rising above city streets. A gangster film might leave them whispering about America's corruption, but a family drama revealed something different, an everyday normalcy that had been absent in their war-torn homeland. But cinema was never neutral. It became a battleground of ideas. In the early days, pro-Nazi camp leaders still held influence. They tried to manipulate the screenings, choosing films that painted America in a negative light. Gangster dramas, filled with violence and corruption, became their favored choice. The message was subtle but clear. Look at this country. This is what your captors truly are. Yet the Americans quickly recognized the danger. They tightened control, ensuring that films reflected the American scene without distortion. Westerns were chosen deliberately, stories of law, order, and justice. Comedies broke down walls of suspicion, reminding the prisoners that Americans laughed just as they did. And then there was Marlene Dietrich. For the POWs, her face was unmistakable. Dietrich had once been one of Germany's most beloved stars, a voice of glamour and national pride. But she had turned her back on Hitler, becoming an outspoken opponent of the Nazi regime and a proud American citizen. To see her now, larger than life on an American screen, was an unspoken act of rebellion against everything the Reich demanded of loyalty. For some prisoners, her appearance was a dagger of betrayal. For others, it was the beginning of doubt. The screenings did more than entertain. They planted seeds of quiet questions, of unsettling comparisons. Why were their captors feeding them white bread when their families back home starved? Why did these so-called enemies seem to live ordinary, free lives filled with laughter and leisure? The silver screen revealed contradictions that Nazi propaganda had hidden for years. Not all welcomed this intrusion of light. In some camps, die-hard Nazis scoffed at the films, whispering that they were staged or corrupted. They insisted that America's laughter was shallow, its skyscrapers a hollow monument to greed. Yet even as they mocked, younger and less hardened prisoners leaned forward, watching with wide eyes. The glow of the projector was difficult to ignore. These nights became rituals. The prisoners marched in, restless and uncertain. They left silent, shaken by what they had seen. Cinema, a tool designed for entertainment, had begun its quiet transformation into something more powerful, a weapon of influence. The curtain had risen, and though the reels still danced with cowboys, comedies, and starlets, soon they would shift. The light would no longer show laughter or dreams. Instead, it would reveal something darker, atrocities captured on film, evidence impossible to deny. The men who sat in those camp theaters did not yet know it. But the silver screen that distracted them from boredom would soon force them to confront horrors that could never again be unseen. The projector whirred, casting shadows across the barracks walls. But not every eye in the room followed the flickering light. In the back rows, hardened officers leaned close, whispering venom into the ears of younger men. "Don't be fooled. This is nothing but American trickery." Inside the barbed wire fences of POW camps, cinema was never just entertainment. It was a contest of influence, a battle fought not with bullets but with ideas. And for many prisoners, the most dangerous enemy was not the guards at the gate, but their fellow Germans still loyal to the Reich. Some camps became theaters of intimidation. Pro-Nazi officers, clinging to their authority, reminded the men of their oath to Hitler. When reels of gangster violence appeared on screen, shootouts and in smoky alleys, corrupt policemen exchanging bribes, these officers seized the moment. "Look," they said, "see the truth of America, a land of criminals and greed. This is the rot they want us to admire." Resistance went further than words. In certain camps, organized groups quietly plotted to sabotage screenings. They spread rumors that the reels carried subliminal messages. They mocked prisoners who laughed too loudly at comedies, branding them traitors. In the dim light of the projector, loyalty to the Führer was tested anew. Yet beneath these clashes lay something deeper, the weight of an entire nation's indoctrination. These men had been raised in a Germany where every newspaper headline, every radio broadcast, and every schoolbook was steeped in Nazi ideology. For years, truth had been carefully rationed, bent to the will of propaganda. Now, inside enemy territory, they were suddenly confronted with images unscripted by the Reich. Could they trust what they were seeing? Or were the Americans simply spinning another illusion? The dissonance was overwhelming. Some prisoners dismissed the films outright. Others sat in silence, torn between the certainty they had been raised with and the strange normalcy shown on screen. Families eating dinner, couples dancing, crowds cheering at baseball games. These were not the monstrous caricatures their government had described. They were people, ordinary, alive, and strangely familiar. American authorities understood this tension, and they exploited it. The films were not chosen at random. Reports from the Office of War Information reveal that cinema inside the camps was carefully curated. Westerns and comedies were favored because they carried little overt politics, yet revealed American values of freedom, justice, and humor. Travelogues showcase landscapes untouched by war, a contrast to the ruins of European cities. Step by step, reel by reel, a different vision of the world seeped into the prisoners' minds. The results were uneven. Older, hardened officers scoffed, holding the line of Nazi loyalty. But among younger soldiers, cracks began to form. They laughed at Charlie Chaplin's slapstick. They marveled at New York's skyline. They whispered in the barracks about how different life might be beyond dictatorship. In private, some even admitted that America seemed less like the land of chaos they had been warned about and more like a place of possibility. It was a subtle shift, but one the Americans counted on. Propaganda had brought these men to war. Now, cinema was beginning to unravel it. Still, the real purpose of these screenings had not yet been revealed. The reels of cowboys, comedians, and cityscapes were only the beginning. What awaited them was far darker. Soon, the projector would not illuminate the charms of Hollywood, but the horrors of history. The prisoners did not yet know it, but the same screen that showed laughter and landscapes would soon confront them with images their leaders had always denied. Skeletal corpses stacked in pits, gas chambers disguised as showers, and the industrial slaughter of millions. The whispers of Nazi officers could dismiss comedies as tricks, or gangster films as distortions. But could they dismiss the sight of their own country's crimes, captured on film by Allied cameras? The soft glow of Hollywood light had begun the erosion, but the shadows of propaganda would only truly shatter when the reels turned to darkness, revealing a truth that no whispered denial could erase. The year was 1945. Across Europe, the Third Reich was collapsing, its cities reduced to rubble, its armies in retreat. And in America's prisoner of war camps, the days of relative comfort were coming to an end. The United States had tolerated the illusion of leisure long enough. Now, the curtain was about to rise on the most brutal truth of all. The re-education program had begun, and it would not be carried out with lectures or pamphlets, it would be delivered with celluloid. In camp after camp, the order was the same. Prisoners were herded into packed halls, their boots echoing against wooden floors. The lights dimmed, the projector whirred to life. But this time there were no cowboys, no comedies, no landscapes of faraway America. What filled the screen instead were the raw, unfiltered images captured by Allied soldiers as they liberated camps like Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. The reels were merciless. Emaciated figures staggered toward the camera, their hollow eyes staring into the lens as if pleading with history itself not to forget. The screen showed skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood, bulldozers pushing corpses into open pits. Liberation footage revealed not victory parades, but haunted survivors wrapped in rags, their faces etched with an exhaustion beyond words. Unlike speeches, which could be dismissed as propaganda, these images left no escape. The camera lingered, steady and unforgiving, offering no room for denial. The reactions inside the camp halls were explosive. Some prisoners shouted in rage, insisting it was all fabricated lies, staged by the Americans. They cried, their voices trembling more from fear than conviction. Others sat frozen, hands shaking, unable to look away yet unable to comprehend. A few broke down completely, soldiers who had once marched proudly under Hitler's banners now sobbing as the images seared themselves into their memory. The screenings were compulsory, attendance was not optional. Guards stood at the exits to ensure no man could slip away. Every prisoner was forced to watch, forced to confront what had been done in their nation's name. For some, the denial held. Decades of indoctrination could not be undone in a single reel of film. They whispered that the corpses were actors, that the Allies had staged it all to humiliate Germany. But among the younger men especially, the images planted seeds of doubt that no whisper could smother. The silver screen that had once entertained them now served as a mirror, and in that mirror, they saw monsters wearing their own uniforms. American officials recorded the impact carefully. Reports noted the stunned silence that followed these screenings, the way conversations in the barracks shifted afterward. Some prisoners, once defiant, grew quieter, more introspective. Others lashed out at their comrades, accusing the Nazi loyalists of betrayal for leading them into a war that had spawned such crimes. And here lay the cruel paradox. The very tool that had once been used by Joseph Goebbels to enthrall an entire nation was now being used to dismantle his legacy. Film had been the weapon of propaganda. Now, it was the weapon of truth. But truth, like a scalpel, cuts deep. These screenings were not gentle lessons in democracy. They were psychological shocks designed to break down resistance, to crush illusions, to force acknowledgement. They revealed not just the crimes of a regime, but the complicity of silence. For every prisoner who wept, there was another who wondered in horror. How much had I ignored? How much had I allowed myself not to see? When the reels ended, the lights flickered back on. Prisoners rose slowly, some with red eyes, others with clenched jaws. The room felt heavier, as though the air itself carried the weight of the graves they had just seen. The golden cage had been shattered, the curtain of propaganda torn apart, and in its place stood a darkness far greater than any enemy caricature, the undeniable horror of what Germany had done to the world and to itself. For many, that night marked the first crack in the fortress of denial. But for others, The struggle had only begun, because once the screen went dark, a question lingered in every prisoner's mind, a question more terrifying than any reel of film. If this is true, then who am I? When the lights came back on after the screenings, silence hung heavy in the barracks, but that silence did not last long. Within hours, the prisoners' quarters erupted with arguments, accusations, and whispered confessions. For some, the reels were nothing but lies, crafted by enemy hands to humiliate the German people. For others, the images were too raw, too relentless to ignore. The divide cut deep. Hardened officers stood firm, spitting out denials with the same discipline they once displayed on the battlefield. Fabricated, actors in costumes, nothing more. They barked, their fists clenched, their authority trembling. But younger soldiers, their pale faces betraying sleepless nights, whispered in hushed tones, "What if it's true? What if the fatherland we bled for was nothing but a machine of murder?" The camps became battlegrounds of belief. Within the fences, men who had once marched shoulder to shoulder under the swastika now turned on one another. In some compounds, pro-Nazi leaders enforced silence with threats, warning that doubt was treason even here. In captivity, anyone who spoke of guilt or shame risked intimidation, or worse, brutal beatings from their own comrades. Yet the images from the screens clung to their minds like ghost skeletal figures, bulldozers pushing bodies, eyes staring back through the grain of black and white film. Reports from American authorities confirmed the fractures. Military intelligence noted sharp increases in prisoner quarrels after the showings, as though the films had detonated unseen explosives within the psyche of the camps. For the guards, the shift was unmistakable. Prisoners were no longer united by defiance. They were splintered, some still clinging to Hitler's shadow, others quietly stepping away from it. And then, in North Carolina, the break became visible in fire. It was 1945 at Camp Butner, a sprawling POW facility that held thousands of Germans behind barbed wire and pine forest. The prisoners had sat through the screenings like all the rest, but here, something snapped. The weight of the images and the futility of denial drove the men to an extraordinary act. One night, more than 1,000 German soldiers gathered. The air was heavy with tension, the kind that precedes revolt. But this revolt was not against their American captors, it was against their own past. In a single, stunning gesture, they stripped themselves of the symbols they had once carried with pride. Uniforms pressed for inspection, medals pinned to their chests, insignias that had bound them to the Reich. Piece by piece, they threw them into a towering pile. Then the fire was lit. Flames roared into the night, consuming the black fabric of Nazi uniforms, devouring the iron and ribbon of medals once awarded for loyalty to Hitler. The prisoners stood in silence as the bonfire raged, their faces lit by the glow, their eyes reflecting both grief and release. It was not celebration, it was mourning for the years stolen, the lies believed, the shame of crimes committed in their nation's name. American guards watched in astonishment. This was no small protest. It was a mass symbolic revolt, 1,000 men publicly severing themselves from the ideology that had led them to war. The act was so powerful that camp reports documented it as a watershed moment, proof that the experiment in cinematic re-education had pierced even the hardest shells of indoctrination. But the story did not end with the bonfire. The revolt deepened the fractures. In other camps, news of the burning spread quickly. Some prisoners admired the courage it took to renounce the Reich so openly. Others called the men at Butner cowards, traitors who had allowed themselves to be broken by enemy tricks. The barracks filled with whispers, the once solid wall of Nazi loyalty now riddled with cracks. The fire at Butner had illuminated something extraordinary. For the first time, German prisoners themselves had chosen to break with Hitler, not under the threat of a gun, but in the quiet acknowledgement of truth. Yet the flames also exposed a darker reality. Denial still clung stubbornly to many. For every soldier who shed his insignia, another clenched his fist around it, determined to hold on, and so the camps remained divided, haunted by the images of the reels and the echo of the fire. The Americans had forced the prisoners to confront the Reich's crimes, but what they could not control was how each man would respond. For some, it was the beginning of liberation from lies, from propaganda, from the chains of ideology. For others, it was the birth of resentment, a bitterness that would not fade with the ashes. Because in the end, the question left smoldering was not about what they had seen on the screen. It was about themselves. Would they accept the truth? Or would they choose to live forever in denial? The war was over, but in America's prisoner of war camps, the battle for memory had only begun. Official records from 1945 describe a strange transformation taking root among German captives. It did not happen with the clang of rifles or the bark of orders, but in silence in the long nights after the reels had finished spinning. For some men, denial hardened into armor. They scoffed at the films, calling them a lied trickery. In the shadows of the barracks, whispers of conspiracy thrived, fabricated corpses, staged atrocities, yet even as their voices rose, they carried the tremor of desperation. Denial, after all, is the last refuge when the truth is unbearable. Others could not escape what they had seen. Letters smuggled from the camps speak in haunted tones. One prisoner admitted, "I wake in the night, and their eyes are there, staring." Another confessed that the medals he once polished with pride now felt like anchors of shame. Some quietly surrendered their decorations to American officers, choosing disgrace over the unbearable weight of honor tied to atrocity. The cracks were visible. American guards noted a change in posture, in speech. The swagger had gone. Conversations once filled with bravado now carried unease. For the first time, many began to see themselves not as patriots of a fallen Reich, but as unwilling witnesses and perhaps participants in crimes without precedent. Could loyalty still be defended when history itself had turned witness against them? The psychological tremors reached unexpected depths. In a remarkable twist, several POWs volunteered to fight for the United States against Japan. Their offers were politely declined, but the gesture revealed something extraordinary, the beginnings of ideological defection. Others dreamed not of returning to Germany, but of staying in America, drawn by its paradoxical promise of freedom even inside barbed wire. Cinema had done what sermons, interrogations, and threats could not. It stripped away the armor of myth, leaving men face to face with themselves. But the awakening was uneven. Like shattered glass, some fragments reflected only bitterness, others the dim light of remorse, and a few the faint shimmer of redemption. And so a question lingered in the dim barracks, unanswered and heavy. When these men finally returned home, would they carry with them the poison of denial, or the fragile seed of truth? Because once illusions burn away, nothing remains untouched. The war was over, but for thousands of German prisoners, the real reckoning began not in Europe's ruined cities, but in the quiet echo of memories carried across the Atlantic. In the summer of 1945, transport ships left American shores heavy with men who had arrived as loyal soldiers of Hitler's Reich and now returned with fractured loyalties, haunted by images they could not forget. They stepped back into a homeland in ruins. Germany was unrecognizable, cities gutted by firebombs, rail lines twisted like broken bones, families scattered by death and displacement. Hunger gnawed at the population, while whispers of war crimes tribunals spread through the rubble. And for those who had sat in the darkened halls of American camps, the weight of knowledge pressed heavily. They had seen what their nation had done: skeletons in striped uniforms, bulldozed corpses, the empty gaze of the living dead. Not all accepted it. Some clung to bitterness, insisting even years later that the films had been staged propaganda. Denial was easier than facing shame, but countless others carried the reels within them like scars. Letters and post-war memoirs reveal confessions of guilt and the strange clarity of disillusionment. For the first time, they began to question not just their leaders, but themselves. The impact rippled across decades. Records show that thousands of these exposed eventually returned to the United States not as captives, but as immigrants. They built farms, opened businesses, and raised families in the very country they had once been taught to hate. To many historians, This was no coincidence. They argue that America's experiment combining humane treatment with the searing, undeniable truth of documentary film produced one of the most effective re-education efforts of the entire war. Where brutality would have bred only resentment, dignity created space for reflection. Where ideology once blinded, cinema had forced open the eyes. And in the silence of those camp theaters, reconciliation had taken root not through lectures or threats, but through the unbearable weight of truth projected on a silver screen. In the aftermath, the question lingers, was this transformation complete, or only partial? Could men truly shed the shadows of the Reich, or did some darkness remain, buried deep? What is certain is this: long after the last bombs fell, long after the smoke cleared over Berlin, it was not the roar of artillery that stayed with these men. It was the flicker of a projector in an American camp, burning into their minds an inescapable reality. And from that light, faint but undeniable, grew the first fragile seeds of reconciliation between enemies. Official records describe the American prisoner of war camps as golden cages. Barbed wire and watchtowers stood tall, but inside, life often looked strangely humane. Prisoners ate well, played soccer, even received medical care that civilians in war-torn Europe could only dream of. Yet within this paradox of comfort and captivity, another experiment was unfolding, one that would pierce deeper than any weapon. The experiment was cinema. At first, it entertained Hollywood musicals, comedies, sweeping landscapes of the American West. These films offered prisoners a glimpse of a world free from totalitarian control, a world where laughter and freedom did not come with ration books or fear of the Gestapo. But as the war's tide shifted, the reels grew darker. American officers replaced cowboys and gangsters with raw documentaries of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen, grainy black and white footage of skeletal survivors, mass graves, and emaciated children filled the screens. It was a mirror no man could easily turn away from. The reactions were as fractured as the men themselves. Some erupted in rage, insisting the images were fabricated. Others sat in stunned silence, their hands trembling, their eyes refusing to blink. Letters smuggled home reveal sleepless nights haunted by the hollow faces on screen. A few, overwhelmed by shame, discarded their medals and insignia, unable to bear their weight. Historians note the psychological depth of these screenings. This was not propaganda in the crude Nazi sense, it was the weaponization of truth itself. Denial could be shouted, but the images lingered, etched in memory, and over time, cracks formed, arrogance gave way to humility. Whispers in barracks turned from defiance to questions. What makes this story haunting is not unanimity, but diversity of outcome. Some men clung to hatred, their worldviews calcified in bitterness. But many others carried away something different, a burden of truth. In later years, thousands of expos returned to America not as captives but as immigrants, weaving themselves into the fabric of the very country they once fought against. The transformation was imperfect, uneven but undeniable. That flicker of the projector in dusty camp halls was more than moving light. It was revelation. It was a collision between ideology and reality, between illusion and undeniable evidence. For some, it marked the beginning of despair. For others, the fragile seed of redemption. And so, history leaves us with a haunting paradox. These men were enemies, yet within captivity they were shown a freedom of thought their homeland had stolen from them. The silver screen that once entertained became their judge, their accuser, and strangely their guide. The war ended, but the memory of those reels outlived the rubble of German cities. They became scars. Yes, but also sparks. Sparks of reconciliation, sparks of humility, sparks of something greater than victory or defeat. Because in the end, the true power of cinema was not just to entertain, or even to horrify, it was to reveal. And in that revelation, however painful, flickered the fragile, enduring possibility of redemption.